Okay, so today we're going to pick up where we left off here, and today we're going to talk about the Americans finally getting involved in this war on a level more than just being an ally to the British and the other allies, beyond just supplying money and munitions. Now, finally, the American fighting force is going to get in the trenches and join the fight alongside the other allies. So, let's start with the preparedness movement. So when the war started in 1914, and probably even when the United States finally declares war and joins in 1917, we weren't a country that was ready for this necessarily. We were a country that was capable of it, but at the moment wasn't exactly ready. So in those years of neutrality, leading up to us eventually joining the fight, it became apparent that at some point there was a really good chance that neutrality wasn't going to continue to be our thing, and so we do start doing some things to prepare for that inevitability. One of the things that happens is that in 1917 we see the passage of the Selective Service Act. The Selective Service Act, which still exists today, is essentially the law that requires, at the time, all men at the age of 18, all American citizens at the age of 18, to register for what's called the Selective Service, meaning you have to put your name in the hat today in the computer. And that meant that the government, by law, could then draft those men from that list. So this is the first time, well, it's not the first time we see this. This is the passage of the Selective Service Act, but we do see the first conscription laws and the first drafts in both the Confederacy and the Union during the Civil War, and we know we talked about that. But it's the Selective Service Act that was passed in 17, with some changes over time, is essentially still a thing today. That means that you guys at age 18, you're going to have to, when I was a kid, when I was 18, I got a card in the mail, I had to fill it out and mail it to the government, and my name went on the list, so that if we had gone to war, they could have pulled my name out of the hat. You'll probably have to do it online somewhere when you turn 18. So what happens is, with the passage of this law that these men over the age of 18 have to register, over 24 million American men register for the draft. In the end, when it's all said and done, somewhere around 3 million will be the total that are drafted. So you do have this massive pool to pull from, but only 3 million unlucky, I guess, if you want to put it that way, Americans' names are pulled out of the hat. And that 3 million, plus some volunteers and things that were drafted, become what is known as the AEF, or the American Expeditionary Force. That's awesome, right? It sounds like something from a Marvel movie. The American Expeditionary Force is, quite simply, the U.S. fighting force during World War I. So if you ever hear a reference to the AEF, the American Expeditionary Force, that was the name we gave to our force that would fight in this war. The AEF was not just made up of men who were drafted from the Selective Service Act. There were also women that served for the United States in the AEF. Now, the women weren't being drafted because they were not, they didn't fall under the Selective Service Act, but there were women who volunteered to go overseas. Some worked here in the United States during the war, but they worked as nurses, they worked as clerks in offices. Some worked as actual uniformed members of the United States American Expeditionary Force. Others worked as civilian volunteers. So we got to give the women their due as well. The leader of the American Expeditionary Force, the general that is essentially the commander of all American forces during World War I, is a guy named John J. Pershing, General John J. Pershing. His nickname was Blackjack. Blackjack Pershing is going to be the guy that calls the shots for how the United States is going to conduct itself once we get into the trenches fighting. All right, well, before we can get our soldiers into those trenches over there in the Western Front and even in the Eastern Front, we got to get them there. So we've got to deal with something. not only dealing with moving our fighting force across the Atlantic Ocean, but also moving our force across the Atlantic Ocean without being destroyed by what? The German U-boats. And so we quickly develop a system, it's called the convoy system, to try to combat the German unrestricted submarine warfare. We know it's a thing, we've talked about that already, and so the Americans devised what they call a convoy system. We use our naval forces to essentially just create a line of battleships from the United States across the Atlantic Ocean to Europe. Now, it wasn't necessarily a line of ships one after another, but there were ships that patrolled a corridor all the way across the Atlantic Ocean, and they were out there looking for and hunting down German U-boats, and also then just physically protecting our other ships who were bringing the soldiers, the ammunition, the tanks, the weapons, and so on and so forth. And right from the get-go, the American entry into the war and how we're going to deal with this is successful. The convoy system works. Not only are we able to move our force across the ocean successfully, but the American Navy also becomes very astute at, and we develop new technologies for this and new tactics, we become very astute at hunting down and destroying German U-boats. So for those years where the German U-boats were just sort of, they had owned the seas, the United States, upon entering the war, started to change that. And from there, it just keeps going in that direction. All right, so we get those soldiers to Europe, and we drop them into the trenches to fight against the Germans and the other Central Powers. But the nickname we give, just like the AEF is the entire fighting force of the United States during the war, the nickname that we end up giving to the American infantry soldier is the doughboy. So you'll hear references to doughboys, American doughboys. You'll hear soldiers being referred to as doughboys. That is a reference to World War I. Basically, it's just an infantry soldier, the guy that got in the trenches and was fighting it out on the battlefield. So I found this picture that is just this great, it's the quintessential look at an American doughboy, a soldier from World War I. There are some very distinctive things here. Number one, let's start with the helmet. The shape of this helmet is very distinctive of not just World War I era, but also specifically American uniforms. Now the French and the Brits actually had similar helmets, but that is a very distinctive helmet. World War II, for example, they're different. They're similar in the Spanish-American War, but they're not quite the same. So anyway, this is a very distinctive look. Another very distinctive thing that we see here with the doughboy is the gas mask. I've always felt like, man, what an ominous looking Halloween costume that would be. A World War I era gas mask and the helmet and the uniform, you could kind of make it a little more scary or whatever. But that gas mask, as you know, was something that the doughboys would have to carry, and you can see he has a haversack around his neck. He would have all of his equipment. There would be gloves, there would be a gas mask, and some other items that the soldier would have to have at the ready for a German gas attack. We talked about the use of the gas in the trenches. So, just like everything else, not only the United States, but all the Allied powers, as the Germans were perfecting weapons with their military machine, we were finding ways to counter that, including the gas mask. A couple other things here. The weapon here is very distinctive as well. It is a bolt-action rifle. Now, I'm not a military historian. That's never been like super interesting to me, so I don't know all the ins and outs about the different weapons and the different guns that were used. But this bolt-action rifle was the weapon of choice for an infantry soldier. The one thing you can't see on this image, and I wish I could have found, but I just like this one with the gas mask, is the pants. The pants that they wore were kind of baggy pantaloons that would be tucked into high boots. And that's just another part of the World War I doughboy uniform that's very distinctive when you see a picture of it. So there you go, there's the doughboy fighting in the trenches. Okay, a couple other just generic things about the AEF and our troops once we got over there into the battlefield, onto the battlefield, was that we decided, and from what I understand, a lot of it was probably the leadership, the military leadership like General Pershing, that we were going to remain segregated from the other Allied forces. Now we're going to fight alongside the French and alongside the British and many others, Canadians and Belgians and whatever, but we're not going to mix our leadership together or our soldiers together into combined units. The other allies had been doing that. You might have a unit that would have some French and British soldiers in it, and they might have a French general leading it and some Belgian other officers leading it. The Americans decided from the get-go that's not what we're going to do. We're coming in, we're going to do it our way. There was a little bit of an arrogance to it. We're going to do it our way, and we're going to fight as individual American units. If the French want to fight right next to us, that's fine. So there was a little bit of an arrogance to it, but there was also a little bit of just a bravado, a show of force in a sense. So not only are we going to segregate ourselves from the other Allied troops, but it's important to point out that by World War I, one of the things that we talked about during the Civil War was the raising of black regiments, the 54th and so on and so forth, but we know that there were some differences about being a black soldier versus a white soldier. Then we got into that era after the Civil War where we talked about the Reconstruction period and things that were changing, but we also really understood that the change wasn't necessarily happening rapid. It wasn't like we snapped our fingers and everybody thought black and white could coexist together peacefully, right? So even by World War I, now things probably had changed quite a bit for black soldiers serving for the U.S. Armed Services, but black regiments and white regiments are still going to be segregated during World War I, and that won't change until World War II. Even after the war begins, our government decides finally to desegregate our military, so it's going to be a little while. In fact, African Americans were not even considered to be members of the Marines, so there was still definitely a lot of segregation. But there you have it, the quintessential doughboy fighting in the trenches. All right, so I don't know if I applied this at the beginning of this lecture, and so I may be reiterating this, but I'm going through this. I'm giving you a very brief look at the Americans fighting in the war because we're going to use a movie, a true story about an American regiment fighting in the trenches to really get a better sense of what the experience was like for those doughboys. So here's just the bigger picture idea. We'll let the movie get into some more details about being a soldier in the war. But once the Americans joined the Allies and we move our AEF into Europe, things start to change dramatically. First of all, we know one of the things that was happening at the same time was that the Russians, a major Allied power, were dropping out of the war because of the revolution. That created a very precarious situation for the other Allied forces, namely the French and the Brits, because it meant that with the Russians out of the war, the Germans did not have to have their forces split between the Western Front and the Eastern Front any longer. They didn't have to worry about the Eastern Front. Excuse me. So what happens is the Germans start to focus their entire attention on the Western Front, and that put a lot of pressure on the French and the Brits. Thank goodness at the same time we added the American force to the Allies. The American fighting force is really what changes the direction of this war. At first, it looked like the Germans were going to crunch through these European nations. Of course, then it turned into a stalemate, we know, for several years. It's the U.S. entering the war that altered that stalemate. And instead of the Germans being able to focus all their attention in the Western Front and potentially taking over Paris and France and moving into Great Britain, it went in the other direction. The U.S. was able to halt any German advance further into France. And then not only did they halt it, but they turned the tide of the war and break the stalemate. And because of the added leverage of the U.S. fighting force, the Allies start to push the Germans back out of France. The Germans realize, and the Kaiser Wilhelm, the leader of Germany, realizes at some point the inevitability of what's happening here with the addition of the Americans into the war. Things are not looking good for the Germans. The Allies not only push the Germans out of France, but they actually start pushing into Germany. And at that point, the Germans and Kaiser Wilhelm started to look for a negotiated peace agreement. He contacted the Allied leaders and said, "Hey, listen, this has gone on long enough. Maybe we should just sit down and come up with a plan to end this thing for everybody." But the Allies, with some probably leadership from the Americans, but I think the French and the Brits were really on board with this as well, continued to push their offensive into Germany, not agreeing to any kind of negotiated peace, but instead calling Kaiser Wilhelm and the Germans for an unconditional surrender. Now, what do you think that means? We learned a little bit about that with Ulysses S. Grant, and he got that nickname, Unconditional Surrender Grant, at Vicksburg, and then some other things he did, right? So an unconditional surrender means you will surrender and you will get no conditions. We, the winners, will call the shots on how this is all going to work out in the end. And so, until Kaiser Wilhelm and the Germans agree to unconditionally surrender, the Allies are going to continue pushing into Germany, and eventually the Central Powers will be forced into an unconditional surrender. And I'm going to leave it at that for now. What you're going to do is use the movie The Lost Battalion to dive deeper into the nitty-gritty of what it meant to be an American soldier fighting in the war. So I'll leave you to that, and the next time we talk, we'll talk about how the peace agreement ended this thing.